Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us in this very special event tonight, Digital Education After COVID-19. My name is Amanda Berry and I'm Associate Dean for Research in the Faculty of Education at Monash University. And it's my pleasure to be hosting this event tonight on behalf of our Faculty of Education. We're delighted to offer this panel discussion with prominent international thinkers in digital education who are going to critically reflect on some of the social, economic and political issues and implications of COVID-19 for digital education. But before I introduce the panel, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the lands on which we meet today in Australia and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to specifically acknowledge that the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, communities of the Kulin Nation, are the ongoing custodians of the land on which Monash University now stands. We pay our respects through our research, teaching and learning to the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung elders and their past, present and future communities. So we're really pleased to have everybody joining us tonight. I believe we have over 800 live streamer registrations from across the world. And I've just been informed from Hong Kong, China, the Maldives, Japan, Sweden, UK, Greece. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, everywhere, wherever you happen to be. And we encourage you to make this an interactive session so you can send your questions and comments at any time through the YouTube chat function. But just a reminder, you need to be logged into YouTube in order to be able to do this. And for those on Twitter, please feel free to tweet throughout this session, use the hashtags and tagging on Twitter that you will see soon on the presentation slides. So just a little bit about our research agenda in the Faculty of Education. So our agenda speaks to the challenges, both contemporary and enduring, of education in its various forms. We're committed to the improvement of education that enables full and equitable participation and that has a lasting and meaningful impact for those who it's intended to serve. We bring our agenda to life through a focus on 5 interconnected themes. And these themes are shaping digital futures, which is the focus of tonight's session, reimagining educational leadership, educating for diversity and inclusion, enhancing health and well-being, and transforming and teaching and learning, with a central connecting theme of fostering fair and sustainable futures. And throughout this year, we're hosting seminars that are highlighting each of these theme areas, and obviously tonight's focus on digital futures. And you can see on the next slide some of the examples of the work that's being carried out in the Faculty of Education through this particular theme. So you see the rise of digital tech and shaping digital futures through exploring datification in schools. So looking at ways in which digital data can be used for social good, improving feedback through feedback effective, a chatbot that is served to provide evidence-based mental health to support teenagers. So to tonight's topic, digital education after COVID-19. And let's be optimistic that there is an after COVID-19. Perhaps it's a COVID-tolerant society that we need to be thinking about now. But let me introduce our distinguished panel. First of all, we have Professor Neil Selwyn from the Faculty of Education at Monash University. And thanks, Neil, he's just waving to you now. We have Professor Felicitas McGilchrist, and she's turning on hers now to say hi. Hello, Felicitas. She's a Professor of Media Research at the George Eckert Institute, University of Göttingen from Germany. And we also have Dr. Ben Williamson. And Ben, we can see you now. Ben is the Chancellor's Fellow at the Centre for Research in Digital Education at the University of Edinburgh. So now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Neil Selwyn, and Neil will be facilitating the panel from here on in. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mandy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this really special event. As Mandy says, my name's Neil Selwyn. I'd like to introduce again my 2 colleagues. So we've got Felicitas McGilchrist and Ben Williamson, who are joining us from Europe. And we're all researchers in the area of digital education. So the 3 of us are just going to take 50 minutes or so to reflect back on what has just happened in education for the past few months of lockdown, and also think about the shift over to emergency remote schooling. And I think this is a really important thing to do for two reasons. I mean, first of all, in the short term, I think we need to start conversations about what can be done better for the remainder of the pandemic, for further school shutdowns, further university online teaching, because unlike the vibe in some countries, and I'm looking at Ben in the UK in particular, we're not out of this by a long stretch of imagination. If and when there are further shutdowns and we're thrust back to remote schooling, we need to ask questions about what can be done differently, what can be done better. And second, I think we need to seriously talk about the longer term ramifications of this really extraordinary moment. The school and university shutdowns are now prompting some serious pushback for reforms, both to compulsory and tertiary education, and talk about what the new normal should be is now taking place at breakneck speed, and substantial changes are afoot. And so I guess, but Felicitas, Ben and myself, if we do have common ground, it's probably that we believe that educators, the broader educational community, families and students need to be better represented in these discussions. So we need to get conversations going about future forms of education that we want to be seen established and take control of the agenda. So we're going to be talking about two aspects of this. And for a broader set of discussions, we're going to be focusing on the digital. I just wanted to do a little bit of plugging for a couple more publications. If you're interested in non-digital stuff, then we did do this Monash rapid response in the beginning of April. After COVID-19, the longer term impacts of the coronavirus crisis in education, 21 hot takes from academics around the faculty, ranging from things like mental health and trauma, all the way through to professional education and leadership. So if you want to think about non-digital things, then definitely have a look at that. And the other thing I'd recommend is something that's just come out on Monday from UNESCO. And this is a really, really interesting new report released on Monday, Education in a Post-COVID World, 9 Ideas for Public Action. I wouldn't necessarily agree with everything that they've written there, but it does give some really strong provocations about the need not to defund education, not to use COVID as an excuse to cut back on education, to give frontline educators autonomy and flexibility, and protect the social spaces provided by schools. So a really interesting set of debates there. And just thirdly, if you are interested in the digital and you want to hear what Felicitas, Ben and I have to say in a more sober, considered, written way, we actually produced a fanzine, or a zine, should I say, with 3 short pieces, which we've given away to you for free. That's a special kind of gift from us, those of you who are who've registered. If not, then we'll put the links up in the chat soon. So let's get on with it. First, I just wanted to say a proper introduction, both to Felicitas and Ben. First of all, Felicitas, hello. How are things going over in Germany? How has the German education system been dealing with things, and what's the current state of schools and university in Germany?
Yeah, thanks. Nice to be here. Nice to be talking in this setting, in this situation. Germany, the schools closed in March, just 2 weeks before the Easter holidays in most of the states, and each state sort of dealt with it in a bit of a different way. Some of them said, that's it, there's no schooling, there's no teaching, there's no learning until Easter. Other states said, okay, we're going to switch now to online teaching straight away. Then there was the Easter holidays, and then there was the whole, okay, how do we do it? Homeschooling has become a word in German. Homeschooling in English has become a word in German. And at the moment, the schools have opened up again. They opened up slowly with the older kids first, and then moving now, I think last week, 2 weeks ago, in all federal states now, all the kids are back in school. But they're back in school usually only in the mornings and usually every 2 days. So the classes are cut in half. And what we're seeing just now, especially, is one thing that really interests me is that when the classes are going back in the federal state where I live, there's no group work is allowed and no partner work is allowed. The classes are all set up in straight lines looking forwards. So you've got this real return to a kind of teaching which hasn't really been in many schools for a long time now, where you've got forward-facing students working on their own papers and their own documents. And that's one set of ideas to start with.
And so the shock of actually going from what was quite kind of radical form of remote schooling back to, as you say, this kind of almost 19th century arrangements, really, really interesting.
Yeah. And the kids, one thing is the kids are so pleased to get back, though. This is something that I've heard from lots of spaces. Kids who also didn't really like school before are really like school now.
Yeah, no, I think we're going to go on and talk about that later on. That's a really interesting take on things. Ben, over to Scotland. I would say the UK, but I guess Scotland is very, very distinct. It has its own education system. I mean, how are things going over there? And how are schools coping with things?
Yeah, well, I suppose education is continuing by turning millions of homes into kind of platforms, spaces where education happens, undergirded by these giant global infrastructures, and schooling continues in this very virtual form. In Scotland, we're in the last week of term. Children haven't returned since towards the end of March, so we've had no contact with school, well, no presence in schools whatsoever. In England, there was an attempt to get children back to school just after the half-term break in early June. Most of that collapsed. A lot of parents didn't want to send their children back. The schools couldn't accommodate the numbers of students with physical distancing regulation. So it's been quite chaotic and highly contested and controversial. Yesterday, we learned that we were planning in Scotland, or our government was planning for a return to a blended model of schooling come the second week of August, where it was expected children would be in school maybe 2 days a week and having a changeover and so on. Completely intriguing, as digital education people, to see members of Scottish Parliament having ferocious debates about blended learning. Which is a term I'm sure was very unfamiliar to them just a few months ago. Anyway, we discovered yesterday morning that the government has decided, no, all children will be returning to school full-time in the second week of August, despite the fact that most teachers and schools have just spent the last several weeks planning for a blended hybrid type physically distanced return. So yeah, I suspect a lot of educators and school leaders are going to be very busy over the coming days as this term wraps up, and most people should be expecting a bit of a summer break.
I imagine any Australian educators listening to this are going to be breathing a huge sigh of relief. I mean, I have to be honest, looking from 10,000 miles away, the word chaotic is probably the word I would probably imagine the UK and particularly England. Anyway, let's move on from that and get to the meat of the discussion. I guess I want to take a bit of time just reflecting first of all about what we've all been through. Ben, I think we all have children, so we've all personally been through this, but actually, as Ben says, from an academic point of view as well, we're interested in what's happened. I mean, how can we make sense of what's happened so far from the first wave lockdown, from the perspective of digital education? And I just wanted to kickstart the conversation by thinking about three so-called success stories in terms of technology. We are speaking through Zoom and then via YouTube, but these big platforms have suddenly kind of come into tow. I'm also interested in the rise of direct-to-consumer ed tech, which seems to be a thing now, and also this bottom-up user-generated content. So, I mean, just to start off with Zoom, but other examples are available. I mean, Ben, first off, what do you take from the rise of Zoom and Microsoft Teams and these other big platforms, which are suddenly now touted as saviors?
The example of Zoom's maybe quite interesting because I think it illustrates perhaps something of the enormous compromises that have to be made when these new platforms are sort of rolled out into new spaces, like into into education practices at the kind of scale that they have been. Clearly, on the one hand, Zoom is been offered for free, and it's enabled interaction to occur between teachers and students, but it's obviously come with huge privacy issues that others have been tracking in detail, and it proved highly hackable as well, with the appalling examples of racist Zoom bombing and so on in universities, particularly in the States, as I understand it. But at the same time, as I understand it, some of that controversy over Zoom and pushback against it did lead the company to have to address some of the shortcomings of the platform and make some effort to kind of respond to those problems and respond to the outrage of many of the consumers and customers who were suddenly forced into a position where they had to use this thing.
Yeah, it certainly struck me as a case study in how what seems to be a huge platform is incredibly shonky. I don't think they seem to have thought about privacy to begin with. And even now they're doing things like introducing pay for end-to-end encryption. So you actually have to pay to be private. So it's really interesting how these things they look kind of multinational and huge platforms, but they are just very, very kind of kind of making it up as they go along. I mean, Felicitas, you wrote in the Techlash zine, which I put up earlier, about how schools were using technology to kind of do the same things that they did previously. I guess Zoom would be an example of this.
Yeah, Zoom is one way of sort of translating something that we always did, which is a certain way of communicating in a whole class setting. Zoom lets us translate that into the online setting. But it does always change it a little bit. And it's like the intention is to translate something so we all feel comfortable. The teacher's talking, just giving instructions, students are talking among themselves, etc. But at the same time, what we're seeing with Zoom, or all with the alternative video conferencing systems that are also being used a lot, is that the students are often, school students, university students are often without their video. So they're muted and the video's off, and they've actually got Facebook going at the same time where they're chatting with their friends at the same time, which enables a kind of chat to each other, which was also always in classrooms a little bit, but it's different now. It's actually more freed up, it's open. Right. A thing that's important in Germany also is these open source alternatives to Zoom, and a lot of the critique oriented at Zoom was because it got so big so quickly, and there was some like Jitsi, the open source alternative, which looks almost the same, works almost the same, and if it had become so big and so successful, it would have also got the same sort of criticism that Zoom had got. It would have been a place for racist Zoom bombing, Jitsi bombing, whatever as well. But I think there's an interesting discussion there about the open source alternatives and what they need to be able to work at scale, and what Zoom and the investment that's behind Zoom that makes it work better.
Yeah, and also, as you say, I think nobody was prepared for this, and so it's really interesting to see how all of a sudden it has scaled up. I mean, Khan Academy is another really interesting example, moving away from these big platforms in a way. I mean, Khan Academy in a way, I guess, is indicative of the rise of direct consumer technology. I mean, Ben, you study the edtech market quite a lot, and Khan has been a force in edtech for quite a while. I mean, what maneuverings have they managed to leverage from the lockdown, and what does this tell us about this rise of direct to consumer edtech that everyone's getting so excited about?
Yeah. So I think we've seen a huge surge of interest in this idea of consumer edtech. That's been reflected in sort of investor enthusiasm in this space, and a kind of dawning realization that the edtech market into the future is likely to depend on parents primarily, and perhaps students themselves, particularly in relation to higher education. So we're in this position now where the understanding is that schools and universities in the next couple of years are likely to experience extraordinary austerity. So they might have deals in place with providers, unlikely or less likely to be making sort of lucrative deals with new providers, as they understandably have to deal with making cuts and so on. So the market moves to those parents and students who in the short term may be experiencing new hybrid models, but in the long term may find that these are actually attractive kind of supplements to the existing kind of provision they're getting from state education. So I think that there's the direct consumer model points perhaps to an expansion of what people have previously called the kind of shadow education market of private supplementary tutoring and so on. So there's been a huge increase in tutoring apps and platforms in China. I believe Wan Fudao received a $1 billion venture capital investment in the midst of the pandemic, as its customer numbers had absolutely exploded. That particular platform, Wan Fudao, claims that it's using artificial intelligence, so it's gathering information about its users and then adaptively responding in a supposedly intuitive machine learning based way. So this consumer ed tech space is interesting because of the way it kind of shifts the kind of market focus, and because it helps to bring in new kinds of techniques like AI, which are perfectly suited to the idea of molding around the individual. And the individual now, of course, is more and more going to be at home and needing the kind of assistance of that private supplementary tutor who is now a robot.
And if we're all individual consumers online consuming education, as soon as you go back into school, it undermines the idea of what you're doing in a kind of public education classroom. And it's also really interesting to think about the connections here. Khan is not just one man standing in front of a video giving maths lessons. I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar business. And I guess it's interesting to see where they've got funding on through the crisis. And Google seemed to be kind of pumping money into Khan. Can't use Google Cloud products. So there's this kind of network, which I think we can get onto later. And I can remember all the criticisms of Khan a few years ago that the actual pedagogic quality was terrible, that some of the content was wrong. All those discussions seem to have been kind of forgotten about now. And all of a sudden, this is the big new thing. You mentioned a few others. I mean, Felicitas, I know, were you talking about Zern maths earlier as a kind of possibly a good example of how these things might be disruptive in a good way?
Well, yeah, the interesting thing for me, one of the interesting things about Khan Academy is also the kind of content that they have been pushing, spreading over these last couple of months. And you look, they've got a lot of, they've got the part of the website that's specifically for Corona, for COVID related, and they've got schedules, day plans. And like Ben said earlier, it's in the whole schedule, the day plan, it's really half-hour, plans, and the family is built in there the whole time. That there should be a family member assisting the kid working on this stuff. And what they've also got though is basically it's educational TV, like back from the 70s. A lot of what they're doing, and this is one of the first things that Germany did as well. As soon as the schools closed, all the state television put on their old educational TV stuff all morning long, so the kids had something to do. It's also a really interesting kind of educational technology. But Zern maths, for me, it's only the maths part, and it's actually designed as a hybrid way of teaching maths with digital technology. It's been going for a couple of years now, just based in the US. Basically, it's a not-for-profit. They've got a lot of money, a lot of funding to try this up, but it's a not-for-profit, so they're not paying back investors. And one of their things that is very important is they embedded in their normal software before COVID, the idea of half the class working individually on their laptops or whatever devices, and half the class being in a small group with teachers together. So that was always part of the technology is that the teacher works together with a small group of kids intensely person to person. And then the kids would swap, those half would work on the maths and the computers and the other half would be the teacher. And that's one thing they've done where it's really the social and the technological together. And another thing they've done though right from the start is to think about which students are represented in this maths. What kind of maths problems do we have? Maths is one of the most ideological kinds of input you can have in schools, because you've got to have the maths problem puzzle. You've got to put 3 + 2 into words. So what kind of puzzles? And they've deliberately tried from the start to have puzzles which speak to all sorts of different lifestyles and family constellations, and not just sort of white middle class heteronormative images which are often used in math puzzles.
So it sounds like it's actually been designed with some kind of forethought and thinking about learning and teaching, which is rare for some of these platforms.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder to what extent it's because it's a not-for-profit, it's got a different set of priorities baked into it. Not to make a big distinction between commercial and non-commercial, but just to think about what that means if someone's coming from a not-for-profit background, what they're writing into the software.
Simon, we're going to talk about design later on as one of the key things we can take forward. It's just interesting you mentioned educational television, because the third thing I wanted to talk about was TikTok. Now, there's been great excitement over TikTok. I'm Generation X, so I've got no business on TikTok whatsoever, but I understand it's been quite the thing over lockdown. Homemade peer-to-peer education content, 15-second videos. So recently announced plans to commission hundreds of experts and institutions to provide educational content to the platform. Felicitas, what's so great about TikTok? I mean, and other alternatives? Is it really user-generated content and bottom-up stuff?
It's complicated. It's always so many different things at once. But I think TikTok there's just so much crazy stuff on TikTok, which I think is fun to see, and the dance moves and stuff like this. But what we've really observed when kids are starting to use TikTok and when they're doing it themselves is this idea of the challenges, having a challenge and working things through, and that it's a really low there's a low barrier to participation in this kind of thing. Lots of kids have smartphones, of whatever kind of smartphones they have. So they can make their own videos and they're producing something and they're experiencing themselves as producers in that moment. And to do something for the school, something which is relevant, that's a thing that I think is really exciting about TikTok. Yeah.
But on the other hand, I mean, it's a huge multi-billion-dollar Chinese-owned company, and you know, it was trying to monetize its hashtag #TalkEdu content way before coronavirus. So I mean, it's really interesting in terms of user-generated content that you've still got this big behemoth behind it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, Ben, what do you make of the appearance of TikTok as a kind of major player now in this education market?
Yeah, I'm personally a little old for TikTok, though I see my son using it, sometimes to my horror. Yeah, I was completely intrigued and in actual fact really enamored of the idea that this was being used by, you know, apparently millions of students to share study tips and create their own videos and share them with their peers and so on. And the numbers that were being talked of in terms of views on the Learn on TikTok hashtag were really quite eye-watering. Yeah, these sort of lovely ideas about what can actually be achieved through forms of participatory social media based sort of learning, you know, kinds of things that many people working in this digital education space have been exploring for years, and both pointing out, you know, what are some of the problems and issues that arise here, but what are also some of the really strong potential. And, you know, it sort of demonstrates these kind of bottom-up peer learning cultures that I think we probably need to understand better as they, you know, expand through spaces like TikTok. But at the same time, when they announced last week that the Learn on TikTok hashtag would be turned more specifically into a kind of dedicated educational channel, and that they would be hiring loads of strategic content partners to develop new content, that kind of completely changes the model. It sort of emphasizes celebrities. You know, in the UK we have people like Rachel Riley, who's a well-known sort of celebrity mathematician. We have actors and so on, to attempt to draw in a larger audience. And one of the, I think it was the general European manager of TikTok specifically said, we hope that this will be more appealing to advertisers who are interested in the youth market, but who have previously been a bit off put by the kind of the edgy feel of TikTok, Kellogg's, those kind of brands and so on. So we're in an interesting position where we have really sort of nice ideas about user-generated peer learning cultures and so on, at the same time as we have merging ideas about education basically as a kind of vehicle for the advertising industry.
Yeah, and if there's one way to make social media not edgy, it's get schools and education involved. And Felicitas, you wrote in your TechLash article about other kind of more probably genuine bottom-up things. You were talking about uncourses and bar camps and some of the things that have been going on in Germany that really do seem to be quite more grassroots and more communal.
I think that this is exactly the point. Whenever anything, just to come back to TikTok for a little moment, Facebook was never a grassroots thing, but when students were talking a lot on Facebook, that was where the communication was happening. Then schools and educators started to use Facebook as a way of reaching kids in their own space, and kids left Facebook, you know. And then TikTok, they were doing it and it was their thing. When it starts to be embedded now with advertising and with teachers giving TikTok activities, they're going to leave TikTok again at this movement. Yeah, in Germany, there's been a lot of, there's a couple of hashtags on Twitter, Lehrerzimmer, and these, where there's a lot of exchange among teachers on what sort of ideas they can do. One Twitter person asked teachers, okay, give me one activity that's not a printed out worksheet. And there was a whole bunch of answers to this, which I think is really interesting because almost none of them were what we would call EdTech, or what we have been calling EdTech over the last few years. It was like an airplane challenge where you have to make an airplane, fold it up, let it fly, measure the mass, take video, upload the video to the school server, or send it by email or whatever. Okay, maybe the learning management system's legacy EdTech, but all of that, it's a video, it's a camera, it's It's doing something physical in your own space and then sharing that. And there was bar camps and courses set up by volunteers, or set up by a small set of people who are also, I mean, their job is also to offer teacher training later, so it's not completely dissociated from a commercial side, but it's by no means these big platforms and these big actors. It's like, for people who have their own startup where they offer teacher education. And they've been doing a lot of online open space sessions. Come with 3 hours and a half-baked idea, and we'll help you by the end of the 3 hours have something you can do in your classroom, oriented to teachers, that sort of thing.
I guess the problem is that if you try and scale that up to a kind of national level, as you say, the magic disappears. We've had an interesting comment from Gillian just reminding us that not all kids can access smartphones. And I would like to add to that actually not all kids can access smartphones when they go back to school. We're in a state of Victoria where smartphones are banned, smartphones are being banned. So there's this kind of interesting juxtaposition that kids are being pushed to kind of do really cool stuff with devices at home, and they're coming back to school. And it is like the 19th century, as Felicitas was saying. Now, I don't want to just fixate on technologies. Zoom and TikTok are all great, but I think we should talk about the wider social implications of all of this. And I wanted to ask you now, from your point of view, what you think the big lessons or issues that have emerged during the past few months have been. What's been utterly predictable from our previous research, and what's perhaps been surprising and maybe even a source for hope. So I wanted to do this in 3 sections, thinking about schools and families and possibly universities, although that's quite a depressing thought. Ben, first of all, I mean, what have you made of how schools in Scotland or the UK have turned to technology? How have schools coped or not coped?
I think it's probably been extremely varied. I would point out that I think most of us are probably only able to report fairly anecdotally. We've been unable to go and do the kind of detailed research that maybe we might have liked to have done. So in large part, my impressions of what's happened in Scotland are confined to what I'm hearing from, or what I'm experiencing alongside my own children, and hearing from other parents. But certainly it's been a lot of Google Classroom and Class Dojo and so on. I think parents have been parents have been put into a position where there's a kind of obligation to agree to be part of these, platforms, and to subscribe to these products, and to give consent now if they haven't already, so that they can participate in G Suite and so on. But I think some schools have been providing kind of daily lessons with the whole kind of Zoom teacher stuff. Here in the particular part of Scotland I live in, because of data protection concerns, teachers haven't had any video interaction with students whatsoever. So everything has been entirely mediated by Google Classroom or the equivalent, with lots of children being sent off to various other products and so on. So I don't think it's been particularly coordinated, and I don't think that's not something I would want to criticize schools for. I don't think schools have been supported at all well here in Scotland. I think what we saw in England was indicative, a kind of panic that there was no coordinated response prior to the Easter break back in April. And then the sudden appearance of this kind of coalition of organizations with a brand new online school called Oak National Academy, backed by organizations like Teach First and a range of foundations and so on. So I think this is, one of the kind of big issues that's come out is that as parents and schools have cast around trying to figure out what to do, we've had the emergence of some perhaps unexpected new sets of alliances and groupings who've been able to provide at speed selections of resources. Some of that's coming from the big commercial providers who, I think we probably would have predicted would move into this space really quickly. And some of it's come from more unexpected spaces like these new, Teach First aspirations, trust, these kinds of groupings that have come together. And in the particular example of Oak National Academy, it very quickly managed to get support from the Department for Education, the main education ministry in England, who kind of seed funded it. So it's been interesting language here about sort of government as a seed funder and an investor and so on. And we had very quickly a kind of national online school for England to try and, you know, sort of settle these very, very kind of unsettled waters that people were floating around on up to Easter. I suppose it's quite interesting that this Oak National Academy, you know, it provided loads and loads of online lessons and so on, was just awarded this week a further £4.3 million to prepare for next year. So it's going to expand with something like 10,000 lessons and a series of curriculum maps. So this completely unknown organization that didn't exist 3 months ago will basically be the platform for the national curriculum for England next year, in the result that schooling is happening in a, you know, at least, you know, in a hybrid kind of form, or maybe taking place at home if we, as seems very likely in the UK, go back into some kind of lockdown and school closures. So I think that's a really interesting issue. I just like to point out one tiny other thing, which is that, of course, we're talking about ed tech, and we are talking from a kind of global north westernized perspective. And if we look to other countries, then the dominant trend has often been towards educational radio. That radio has been a huge enabler of access to education in low and middle income countries in a way that probably far exceeds or could compete with the kind of scope of ed tech in our own context. And I think, you know, we should explore that much more carefully. Who creates educational radio, and how does that get distributed? I heard stories of radios literally being kind of transported out to small villages and so on. That's a really interesting part of ed tech that perhaps we know far too little about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going back to the Oak National Academy, that wasn't put out to tender, that £4.34 million. So it's either very innovative, speedy thinking, or what Australians might call a rort. I'm sure you can guess what that means. And it's interesting what you said. We are completely talking from a global north perspective. I was in a conference earlier this week where someone was talking from an NGO that worked mainly in Nepal and around that region. And she was talking about the same thing: radios, books, preloaded kind of burner cell phones, and all sorts of very innovative but kind of low tech solutions. What I found over in Australia is there's a huge gap between the private schools and the public schools. The private schools really did seem to be ready for this. And a lot of these have been really going in for synchronous lessons, 5 hours of Zoom a day, and very kind of sophisticated things. And one of the things I'd love to see if there was a future shutdown is the private sector kind of stepping up to kind of support public school teachers. But on the flip side, some of the less advantaged schools have been actually going low tech and just photocopying out packages and delivering them once a week, having no online interaction at all. So, I mean, there's huge differentials, even in a kind of very privileged country like Australia. And then, I mean, we had a comment from Chandra earlier on talking online about the rise of online tutoring. And again, we've seen this differential. Middle-class households very able to buy resources, having the time to support their children, but also invest not only in these apps, not only in these direct-to-consumer apps, but in direct online tutoring. This idea of the Zoom tutor that can just sit and look after your kid while they learn at school has been a thing as well. And the other thing which I've also seen in Australia, well, two things: schools being flexible, the best schools being flexible, not kind of assuming that everyone's on the same site, the same time frame and same synchronicity, but also the lack of conversation about data privacy and child protection, technology governance and accountability. I mean, those are things I think that we really do need to get our heads around the next time we go down to lockdown. But just very quickly before we move on to the future, or before we move on to families, actually, how have schools been coping in Germany, Felicitas? Is there anything else to add that we've not covered already?
I think one bit that's maybe specific, or maybe that I've observed in Germany, is a real disjunction between this juncture between the public discussion, the media, the talk shows, and the practices in schools. And there was one of the big German talk shows, Hard aber fair, tough but fair. They had, a bunch of politicians on, and the teachers and the parents. And it started, the whole thing was oriented at saying teachers have not done enough, teachers have not done enough. Germany has messed up because Germany's not digitalized enough over the past few years. These are discussions we've been having in Germany for a long time. Germany feels in these public discussions very much like Germany's not the forerunner it should be. It's lagging behind. This is big discussion about lagging behind. And it's specifically, I try to turn that around and say, Germany is a forerunner in those data privacy and data protection discussions that you two have just mentioned. They've not rushed in to buy into lots of these commercial platforms because of the data privacy and data protection and data security issues. We know from Sweden, Thomas Hillman was talking about Sweden, that lots of schools are very autonomous and most schools are working with Google Classroom, Google Education. In Germany, almost no schools work with Google Education. It's not acceptable. It's not okay. So that there's one thing. So there's this teacher bashing going on in the public, and it's not digital enough. It's not teachers are not doing enough. But on the other side, when we have a few research projects where we've been accompanying schools for a few years, and I was talking to the school teachers and some head teachers and things, and what they're reporting is the teachers have done a massive amount of preparation in the background. They've been, doing stuff all weekend to try and get things ready. And they're specifically orienting sometimes to those kids that are at danger of being lost, the families that need more support. So in the public sphere, the parents are speaking who have a certain cultural background, so that they're speaking in the public spaces. Those are the kids that the teachers are perhaps not orienting to as much, because this is an assumption that they can deal with it themselves. That's one thing. And we've really seen is that schools, parents are supporting the schools that communicate their decisions. If a school says, look, we're trying to make sure we're keeping all kids on board, that's why we're not talking to you as much, then the parents are happy to not be talked to. And this attempt to, as you said earlier as well, to reach the schools, to reach the students, to meet them once a week, students that don't have the technology, the teachers, are cycling there, sitting on a park bench at 1.5 meters distance and handing over a packet of paper and talking through the week and saying, what's happening at home. That sort of connection isn't visible in the public sphere as much as that. Some parents are not happy because they're just getting printouts.
Yeah, one of the things I would really love to see is a much more kind of open conversation, just reflecting on what everyone's actually really been doing, and maybe kind of just swapping stories, both good and bad, for the time we have to do this again, because so much of this has been kind of under the radar. The amount of emotional labor that teachers are having to be put in and parents as well. I'm going to move on quickly, actually, because we wanted to talk about the future as well, and we've talked a bit about families. Apologies for not talking so much about higher education, or indeed vocational education. I think that's another hour that we could do if we were invited back. I wanted to just move on to what's going to happen next, this longer term picture. And as the pandemic progresses, and eventually, hopefully, as Mandy says, we can reach a stage where we've worked out how to live with the virus. What else is being put into place in the long run that's under the guise of kind of this post-pandemic new normal? I think I described it in a previous podcast as dark forces are gathering, which is a very kind of pessimistic way of looking at it. It may be a bright new revolution, and rethinking of education is underway. But I'm interested in what trends and coalitions and ideas that you're both picking up on, and what do you make of it all? And I guess, first of all, Ben, I mean, you've hinted at this earlier, this kind of pandemic power networks, these mobilizations of corporations. I mean, what are these networks, and what do we need to be aware of?
Yeah, so it was in the piece that was in your little zine. So it's what's really struck me is, I suppose my attention was first drawn to all the various commercial organizations, Google Classroom and Microsoft and Amazon and so on, that seem to be, trying to take a slice of the pandemic pie in schools, as it were. But very quickly became apparent that actually what we're really looking at here are vast coalitions and alliances of all sorts of multi-sector types of actors of various sizes, which have, in the context of COVID-19, have coalesced and seemed to very quickly negotiate a whole bunch of shared aims and aspirations, which have both short-term and long-term trajectories. In the first instance, it's all about enabling access and reducing the potential for widening inequalities and improving equity and so on, you know, in alliances that include actors as diverse as UNESCO and the World Bank and the OECD and Google and Microsoft and Zoom and Khan Academy and a whole bunch of other NGOs and civil society organizations and so on. There's something really interesting going on if we think from a kind of policy perspective about these new kind of policy networks that have formed in a specific context out of a specific set of, you know, relatively short-term concerns, but which are then becoming the kind of base from which to set out a whole bunch of longer-term reformatory aspirations. So an organization like the OECD, which is a partner in this big UNESCO coalition, is very strongly promoting its vision, which it's had for a long time, of a kind of digitally enabled, reformed set of education systems which are much better configured to delivering the skills required in a digital economy and so on. And it's now in alliance with Google and Microsoft, who talk very similar kind of language, who seem to now have, you know, very similar long-term reformatory aims, and have, you know, set out the kind of the organizational networks and in fact the technical networks to enable that to happen, because they've managed to get Google G Suite and Microsoft 365, you know, embedded in places which it probably otherwise never would have gone to. It's, you know, these infrastructures have eaten into new spaces, new territories. So there's a really intriguing policy angle which needs following up for years to come here. That, you know, I think the future of education in many respects is being, you know, crafted into being, you know, very contingently through these new organizational alliances and through the kind of technical systems that they're expanding into all sorts of new spaces, including into people's homes, families' lives.
We don't want to get too conspiratorial about this. And I guess if the UK government, the English government are just giving 4.34 million away to their mates, I mean, maybe Microsoft, Google, and this kind of, as I say, these big networks are better than that. Are they acting in bad faith?
No, I don't think they're acting in bad faith. I think they are providing essential support to education systems in the short term. I think, you know, as any academic of education would do, we need to ask serious questions about, you know, where is the kind of locus of power and control in determining what gets taught in school, in determining what kinds of resources are presented to students in terms of control over the curriculum. All of the kinds of organizations that we're seeing in this space now are in many ways, you know, forming into coalitions to seek to determine what that future looks like, but also in some respects competing with one another, and trying to translate their various different organizational interests into something that they can pursue together more strongly. Now, it might be that those futures are extremely beneficial and they will, you know, reduce inequality and so on, but I still think we have a, you know, should make that research commitment as critical academics to try and understand those processes and the dynamics of future making that we see going on right now at huge scale.
Absolutely. And also the obligation that these actors have to actually stick around. I mean, things like alt school, for example, as soon as they kind of get bored or work out it's not profitable, you pivot, but then you just leave a whole bunch of students and parents and families in the lurch. Moving on to another thing, I mean, Felicitas, I was really interested that you were talking before about design. It was really interesting, that example you gave of the maths platform. I mean, what kind of design issues are you seeing kind of coming up that might give us hope?
Yeah, I have to start with the not hope though, if I'm thinking about design, like exactly the kind of things Ben was talking about. There's a specific design behind those. And if we've got at the moment maybe 3 different kinds of design orientation that are being embedded into the whole education system. And the one is this kind of infrastructure stuff, the Google Classroom, the Microsoft Office. It's like the background, and it's designed to do stuff you always did in the digital space, mostly, but it's then got this huge power to be unfolding in there. Then the second kind of design is where things are really about relations, about communication, about making sure those kids don't get lost, finding some way to keep connecting. And Ines Dussel was telling me in Mexico, 90% of teachers are using WhatsApp to discuss. WhatsApp has become an educational technology because that's the low barrier way to contact everybody, to get everyone involved in the communication. And that's like the core. It's almost like it's suddenly this whole connected learning, the Connected Learning Alliance, connected learning kind of a way of understanding education as the interests of the student plus the relationships plus the opportunities to translate something. These three, this has become like, for many parts of education now, I think in lots of different parts of the world, the basic, this is what we do. And that wasn't the case before Corona. So there's the design elements going in behind there are thinking about relations and communication and interaction. And this is something that I've described previously, like in the last few years, as like a marginal discourse that needs to become more central. Now that it is more central, it's like, right, but wait a minute, what's completely missing from this discussion of the communication interaction, which focuses on individuals and on classrooms and on these sort of focused settings, what's completely missing is a kind of design justice agenda. And there's a lot of exciting research on design justice, the Design Justice Network. Sasha Costanza-Chock, who's just written a new book about this design justice thing, where the idea is, how do you design participatory ways, sort of socio-technical ecological networks or learning settings, educational processes, which center those users who are usually marginalized and usually not thought about. And there's an example using, embedding diverse people into the images is just one tiny aspect, but there's so many different ways that we need to change the materials and the learning apps and the software that are being used to include students who are not usually thought of when these are being designed. The problem is that this sort of design, you can't just do it like this. Microsoft and Google, they can just come, right, okay, there's a pandemic, we can jump in and we can do something. This participatory design, you can't do from today till tomorrow, suddenly make new stuff.
Mm. And it's slow work, and they talk about designing from edge cases. So we've had a few comments about immigrant children who can't speak the kind of the language of the country they're in, kids with special needs. I mean, these are the kind of users that never really tend to be designed. And I guess the design justice approach is to design from those edge cases and then kind of work inwards, which is just a different mindset. Now we've got a few minutes to go. I know Ben has to go and do some homeschooling. Luckily in Australia, I just need to go to bed. But just before we left, there's two things I wanted to talk about. Just one thing to Ben. You've been tweeting recently about you're seeing this kind of emergence of social emotional learning as a kind of post-pandemic solution. I mean, what's going on over there? It sounds horrendous.
Yeah, well, I think probably we're going to see a big surge of interest and promotion of social and emotional learning. There's obviously, huge concern over the impact of this COVID experience on the physical and mental health of young people, and in some cases, obviously, children will require additional support. But I think we need to be aware that there's, been a long-standing attempt by various different organizations to measure and assess and improve social and emotional learning, and different organizations promote that for a variety of different reasons. And one of the reasons is because social and emotional learning is seen, and kind of non-cognitive skills are seen as a substrate to academic achievement, which therefore has some kind of economic value in terms of producing certain forms of workers and so on. So I'm just wary of kind of straightforward assumptions that actually drafting in a whole bunch of social and emotional learning resources that are available and are out there and are being promoted pretty strongly, also invite all sorts of other agendas and concerns into our schools. Yes, clearly we need to attend to the well-being of children when they return to school, or if they don't return to school and they're remaining in their homes. But I do think we need to be really careful about what kinds of subtle changes we'll see to very ideas about sort of purposes of education, focusing on the non-cognitive over the academic and so on, that we might see emerging from that. It's something that I think we just need to follow and try and understand the dynamics and effects of much more clearly over coming months and years.
Yeah, and for anyone interested, I mean, you've written before about the comp-sci complex, this kind of illusion of psychology and computational science, and how EdTech is kind of, right in the middle of all of that.
Yeah, it brings all sorts of new forms of measurement. I mean, there are all sorts of platforms out there now. Panorama is one of the biggest ones in the States, for example. It's used in thousands of schools. It's supported by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. It's promoting itself pretty extensively at the moment with a whole raft of new surveys and instruments and data visualization and analytics tools to enable schools to assess students' health and well-being, their social and emotional learning, their growth mindset, their grit, and all of these kinds of things, to assess all of that at a distance as a way then of identifying particular targeted support as required. I think it's one indication of just how extensively a lot of children who've gone through this experience are going to be measured over coming years. You know, they're going to be measured in terms of learning loss. They're going to be measured in terms of learning gain. They're going to be measured in terms of health, well-being, social and emotional learning. They're going to be turned into graphs. They're going to be the most extensively statistically analyzed bunch of kids, you know, in the history of education.
But they need to be resilient. Right. Finally, we've got a couple of minutes to go. But I just wanted to finish on, I mean, what do you think the educational significance of this moment actually is? If we look back in 20 years' time, is this actually genuinely a once in a generation tipping point or a game changer for education? Or is it just a blip that might just fade away? I mean, clearly the actual pandemic itself is a global public health disaster, and the loss of life and the societal disruption is kind of off the scale and was going to scar us for a decade at least. But in terms of digital education, I mean, is this really as significant as we're thinking it is at the moment? Is this going to fundamentally alter things? What do you think, Felicitas?
I think two answers. And the one is, there's been a few surveys in Germany of teachers, you know, what are you doing now? What impact does it make? And like 85% say there's so much more digital education, and more than half say I'm definitely going to use more technology later. And there's an aspect in Germany that the access, which was never there before, is now there, whether it's donated laptops or there's been some funding for people who have benefits so they can buy hardware. That access, the hardware is there now. So the decision in what direction it goes in the future can now be made on a different basis. So the question is, what decisions are made about what kind of future we want? And that's the first thing. The second thing for me is, though, it's become quite clear that crises are what make change. And maybe this pandemic was just one crisis. This is something that theoretically we've known this already. Crises are what lead to change, but now you can really see it. And what we can imagine in the future is there are future crises are coming, ecological crises, different crises, and each crisis is going to have some sort of unexpected leap, unexpected jump. And we wrote a paper last year imagining 3 futures, and in none of these 3 scenarios did we imagine some sort of crisis. When I look back now and I think, how did we not think about some sort of rupture? They were all 3 futures which sort of flowed in different directions from today. So if we have a crisis now, who can react to a crisis quickly? And this is the thing of slow and quick from before. Who is able to provide a quick fix, a quick solution? And which kinds of, and that's like Google, it's like the big ones, Microsoft, etc. It's also the big, all sorts of different corporations and different levels who've who've been working slowly in the background and now can offer a quick solution to this sudden new situation. Which means that if we want to develop a different kind of future for education, one where convivial technology is in the foreground, respectful design, these sort of keywords, then we need to now make sure people are in position to develop a long-term strategy so they're ready for the next crisis, which will come at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in Australia, we had a summer of bushfires, which we thought was a crisis, and we didn't do much about that. Hopefully after this crisis, we'll be in a more of a crisis mindset. That's a really interesting way to think about it. Ben, is this a big tipping point, or is it the equivalent of the millennium bug and we'll all forget about it in a few years' time?
I think we're seeing enough signals to speculate that we could see some fairly long-lasting and significant changes to education. I don't think it's as simple as just assuming some kind of commercial takeover. There's been some nice explorations of Naomi Klein's idea of disaster capitalism and a kind of pandemic shock doctrine, and maybe we see that reflected in some of the stuff that's going on in the States around getting Bill Gates in to reimagine education in New York, rip down the schools. You don't need them when you can do everything the Gates way. This kind of moment of crisis as an opportunity to outsource education. And, maybe that will happen in a limited way. But at the same time, we need to recognize that in that Gates example, for example, there was pretty immediate pushback. And there's a long history with the Gates Foundation of a lot of their stuff never really working, often with fairly devastating results, but also of campaign groups and educators and teacher unions and so on, forming, really quite powerful bottom-up coalitions to push back against these kind of tech wealth-based imaginaries that are seeking to change education to kind of conform to a particular, perhaps corporate view. So we might see, well, I'd hope we'd see pushback. I mean, maybe not blind pushback without considering what the benefits of a bit of a rethink of, public education's never been perfect, and it certainly wasn't, 4 months ago. But I'd like to think that we'll see, the emergence of these kinds of groups, like perhaps we've seen in New York, that say, hang on, actually we've got a better idea, we've got a better view, we've got a better future, and maybe it involves, a better sense of respect for teachers and a commitment, as Felicitas said, to forms of justice and so on, that, actually we don't want to roll out systems that for many appear to be highly surveillant and potentially discriminatory. And I'm optimistic that we will see that. I mean, earlier on, Neil, you waved that document that came out this week from UNESCO. So on the one hand, you've got UNESCO kind of promoting a lot of these platforms, but you've got other parts of UNESCO actually saying, well, here are 9 public actions, which are all about empowering teachers and, respecting their professionalism and working with students as stakeholders and educators themselves as stakeholders and families in trying to, rethink how we respond to education. And that new UNESCO report explicitly rejecting the idea that public education should be built on an infrastructure of digital platforms owned by private companies. So even within an organization like UNESCO, we see this kind of conflict, this contestation over the various different, imagined futures which are in play. So my sense is there will be a lot of resistance to some of the kind of dominant narratives of the future that we're being told at the moment. And, I think, one of the reasons I think you convened this conversation was to try and seed some of the sort of the critical issues that needed to be pursued, not just by people like us, but by educators and unions and so on.
So that's exactly why we called it Techlash. The Techlash starts here. I mean, if Google can renege on sidewalk labs in Toronto, if IBM can kind of put a hold on facial recognition technology, change can happen. And we're at this moment, I think, where we can possibly do that. So Exactly, that's exactly where I thought we might finish. So thanks ever so much thanks ever so much for both of you taking time out of your morning to actually do this. I kind of strong-armed you into doing it, but it kind of worked out really nicely. So thanks ever so much for that. Thanks everyone for watching online as well. I'm sorry we didn't get to kind of answering all of your questions, but hopefully you got something from what we were saying. And also thanks to Chantal, Grace, Luke, everyone else in the backroom team for kind of making the tech work. I'm amazed that Zoom didn't fall down. And thanks back to Mandy Berry for bringing everything to a finish.
Thanks very much, Neil. Yeah, thank you so much to the panel. I think, I'm sure you'll agree with me, everyone, that this has been a really fascinating discussion, thought-provoking, insightful. Ben mentioned, about these ideas of putting our finger on critical issues and the ways that we truly engage with them. And I think the panel has done a fantastic job of articulating some of those issues and pushing our thinking around those. And many of the comments and questions that people have sent in also reflect those ideas. And it's really interesting to have those perspectives across the different country contexts and thinking about the context of schooling in which people are operating, whether it's from home, from the physical place of school, higher education, etc. And I'm also gratified to hear some of those hopeful messages amongst the dark edges there. And it's not all about corporate takeover, but I really take the point that there's an important role for teachers to play in all of this, in how they see themselves pushing back and feeling their own agency, and thinking about the things that are relevant to their students and their context and how they take on these particular technologies or think about them. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. As Neil has said, it's not too early in the morning for Felicitas, and that we really appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness in contributing to this panel. Has been exceptionally stimulating and helpful for many of us in our thinking. So Ben Williamson, Dr. Ben Williamson, Professor Felicitas McGilchrist, and Professor Neil Selwyn, thank you so much for your time and for your ideas. And we really look forward to everybody continuing their participation in these Zoom seminars that we're running around our research agenda at Monash. And we hope that you can tune into the next one that we'll run.